And it said that we enter the broadcast. So it looks like we are live and we're ready to go. So hello, everyone. My name is Angie Card, and welcome to the Intellectual Stock podcast. Thought Corner podcast. This is what happens when you go live. You get all choked up on your first time. But I'm Angie Card, and today we're talking about why Black Republicans are not resonating with Black Democrats. And we're going to explore the historical debate and kind of figure out ways in which we can make the conversation better, so that at least we can bridge some commonalities in the different group arguments, and see if we can kind of make some progress. I feel like when you have two different aspects of argument, you don't really get the progress that you need. So to help me out with this conversation, I have the executive director of Unhyphenated America, Christopher Harris, with me. We were scheduled to have Murrow Rutledge with us, who is a candidate running for governor of Virginia. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to join us a little bit later, but we're going to keep it moving. So Christopher, before we start, why don't you tell people a little bit about your background and what you do at Unhyphenated America?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all, Angie. It's an honor, privilege, great to connect with you. There's been a lot of great, especially through LinkedIn. I've been flooded with connection requests on LinkedIn, and they're all like people who are also connected with Angie. So yeah, I guess our messages have resonated with each other, and I appreciate it. What I do with Unhyphenated America is we promote the idea that America's best when it's unhyphenated. That we believe that if you understand, if you believe, and if you promote the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then you're an American. And if there's no need for any prefix or suffix, you're just an American. And we can go deeper on that to sit there and talk about the fact that hyphen actually divides. So we want to help get rid of the hyphens that divide us.
Okay. And, I talked to you about this, Christopher. I want to do a follow-up podcast about just what you guys do in that ideology, because I think it's really important for people to explore that and even that discussion, because I agree with that ideology to an extent, just because I don't believe that America should be tribalized. But I do believe that America is comprised of individuals from different cultural backgrounds, and individuals should embrace their cultural backgrounds, but those backgrounds should not be leveraged against them politically and socially. And so I want to get into what y'all do at Unhyphenated America a little bit more, for sure. So we're talking about, when you think about Black conservatism and Black liberalism, first off, I need to ask you, have you always been conservative?
The short answer is yes, but I would say there's a difference between being conservative versus being a conservative.
Okay.
Right? I was raised in a conservative type household. I mean, my parents have been married. I count myself as very blessed and fortunate that my parents have been married for 52 years, which is a rarity in the world overall. But especially in the Black community, the fact that my parents have been married for 52 years, and that influenced a lot of the things that I've seen, like you, my family's from Detroit. And unfortunately, my parents are the only one out of all their siblings who are still married.
Oh, wow.
And fortunately fortunate for me that they're still married, but among, the family, unfortunately, the rest of the family has not maintained their marriages. And that obviously played a huge role in my worldview. My father's retired military. I mean, he did 24 years in the Air Force as a federal agent in the Air Force, and then he was a sheriff, a deputy sheriff for 12 years. So that's the kind of background that I was raised in. And my parents use what I would call universal success principles, which is what conservatism is. However, like a lot of people, let me give you a little bit more depth on that. I'm a military brat, like I said. I was raised primarily overseas, in Germany, 1980s, Cold War, so on and so forth, right? And then I moved back stateside at 18 years old, right after graduating from high school. And then I started being part of the culture, if you will, right? And the culture.
I'm sorry for interrupting. Hey, Merle, sorry about that. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. I was just trying to get logged in. It took a little bit longer but I'm here. I'm ready.
You're fine. We're just doing introductions, and Christopher was telling us about his background, so we'll get to you next.
Okay. No problem.
So yeah, I mean, I was raised to see myself as an American, and you have to understand. Obviously, I'm black. I mean, my family was never, not acknowledging that we're black because that's just stupid to act like you're not black. My father was part of an elite part of the United States military as an OSI agent. My father was one of the first 10 black OSI agents, which is the Office of Special Investigations. It's kind of everybody's heard of Navy NCIS, right? Well, OSI is kind of a similar thing. He was one of the first 10 black, or he might even been one of the first 5, but I know he's one of the first 10 black OSI agents. And so we were always acutely aware of the fact that we were that one fleck of pepper in a sea of salt. So of course I knew I was black. When people said, they go, well, you don't realize you're black. I'm like, shut up. You should just stop talking because that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Of course I know I'm black. How stupid is that? Now,
why do they say that? I mean, because honestly, that statement is the reason why we're having this discussion. When I tell people that I'm a black conservative, they automatically start stigmatizing and making assumptions about how I feel about myself and my community.
Well, because what we've been led to believe is that you have to embrace the worst aspects of being black in order to be authentically black. And like you and I talked about the other day on the phone, the things that we see today are not the norm. This is not the whole of the black experience. Because, my parents have been married 52 years. Unfortunately, their parents divorced, but my mom and dad were both born into marriage. In my direct paternal line, 6 generations, we've all been born in marriage, right? That was the norm. It's only been in the last 30 or 40 years where out of wedlock birth was not the norm. So, and it wasn't the norm that everything was dysfunctional. And as I said before, one of the issues I had, and I've addressed this with my parents.
Before you get into that, I want to get Meryl. I want to
get. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Meryl.
And then we're going to get into these topics because a lot of what you're saying is definitely the conservative perspective about the things gone wrong in the black community. So before we get into that, we have with us a candidate running for Virginia, Mr. Merle Rutledge. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Merle Rutledge, and I am running for governor of Virginia for the Republican nomination as a write-in. Now, all about me is pretty much, I came up from ground zero. I'm the rags to riches story that basically came out of nowhere to somebody being ranked 1% behind front runners and millionaires, in other words, in the first polls. And it's all because I believe in fighting for those who don't have a voice. I have a proven track record of fighting for people's constitutional rights. I call it like I see it when it comes down to police brutality, as well as how citizens interact with the police, and making sure I try my best to save lives more than inflame people to destruct.
Okay, thank you, Merle. Absolutely. And, here's the thing. The purpose of this conversation is not to be destructive. It's really to provide perspective because, like I said, and you all probably have this experience too. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I feel like I've always grown up with a conservative religious ideology and just personal moral ideology. But I feel like in terms of the social political lean, obviously I'm like every other black that, has switched over. We were conditioned to believe that voting Democrat was the way that we should go because the Democrats are for the black man and the Republicans are for the white man. And so I've never really even given the Republican Party a lot of, thought, even in terms of allegiance or patriotism or anything like that. But I never had that allegiance or patriotism to the Democratic Party either, because I've always had like this level of cognitive dissonance with, the rhetoric of that party versus the outcomes of that party. So, when I try to talk to some of my liberal friends about, conservative ideology and how, we are really raised conservative if you were born in some level of religious house upbringing, we were all kind of raised with like some kind of moral compass. But I think where a lot of Black Democrat, liberal-minded individuals are confused in terms of Black conservatives is, our allegiance and our connection to the community, right? A lot of Black liberals believe that Black conservatives are disconnected from the struggles of their communities, the mindset of their community, and that they lack empathy in the problems in the community. So let's kind of go into that.
If I can address that first, if you don't mind, Angie. So you see what's on my shirt, right? It's Alpha Phi Alpha, right? Mm-hmm. The Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, right? The oldest Black Greek letter fraternity out there, right? But I'll tell you, I am at odds with many of my fraternity members, and I've said this to their face. You guys annoy the crap out of me for several reasons. I don't believe in the talented 10th mentality. I did not join the frat out of the belief of talented 10th mentality. I don't think that I'm special. And the problem is too many other Black Greek letter members think that they're special. But when you start asking them these questions and you say like, okay, so how did you get to where you are, right? How did you get to be, at this level? And they'll be like, well, I studied, right? They'll say, well, I did ABC.
That was the Black blueprint.
Yeah, they say I did. This is what I'll say, so understand, being empathetic is important. Here's the question. What empathy is required in order for you to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G? What empathy is required? And that's the problem that I have in the community. And listen, I heard somebody says, my tone is my tone. I know people say, well, we need to be careful with our tone. I was raised around grown men and I was in sports and all that. And guess what? My coaches and all the grown men, they didn't coddle me and they didn't watch their tone when they spoke to me. Grown men talked to me like they were trying to help me grow to become a grown man. And one of the problems that I have, and I've seen with people, is like I see too many men who are sitting there going, well, yes, but you're not giving me the warm fuzzies. I need you to speak to me in a warm fuzzy manner. And I'm like, you obviously weren't raised around men, because men don't talk to other men in this warm fuzzy manner. Men talk to other men directly. We don't go out of our way to offend each other. I'm not going to sit there and say, you're this blankety blank, so on and so forth. But men have direct conversations with other men. So that's one of the issues I have, is that people, especially when I hear grown men saying, well, you should moderate your tone more when you're talking to other men. Then you should listen to someone else. But what kind of results have they gotten?
Let me ask Merle, can you chime in on that point that Christopher just made in terms of, because here's the thing, I've gone back and looked at debates between Black Republicans or Black conservatives and Black liberals. And it really, the Black conservative men really, echo your argument, Christopher, that, you got to stop blaming somebody else. You need to get up off your butt. You need to do something different. You need to educate yourself and you need to be great. So is it really just that simple? Merle, what do you think?
It actually is. I agree with Christopher Harris completely on his answer. The fact is, people got to realize life is short and you can't continue to keep blaming everything else but yourself at that point. And you're teaching your future generations to actually blame others for your mistakes. And realistically, we have to get out of that blame game. And I'm like, what good is it if you're here today and die tomorrow and we're going to blame each other from the grave? No, we need to start fixing the problems in our communities and start waking up to the realities of what is really going on. And we're discussing that right now. Thank you.
Absolutely. So,
and Angie, if I could add one thing, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say, I've had people ask the question, well, how come more men are not like in the schools? There should be more men in the public schools. One of the problems is the public schools have become, for all intents and purposes, feminized. that they want more males. See, here's what they want. They want the
You know what?
presence of a physical male in school, but they don't want to allow men to teach from a masculine standpoint. They want you to physically be there as a male, but if you talk to another male child or even a female child like a grown man does, they say that's unacceptable and they try to drum you out of the public schools. And this
So
is part of the problem.
is that a liberal
Oh, absolutely.
liberal pushback, or so you're saying that, you know, with the liberal ideology, they're desensitizing men and they're making them more pretty much.
They're feminizing men. They're not desensitizing men. Males are exponentially more feminized than.
So do you believe that's why so many Black liberal males are attached to these arguments of struggles that are constantly being perpetuated by the left?
Absolutely. Most of them, listen, they man up. Okay. See, this Thomas Sowell always asks these questions, Merle, and you probably heard this, right? He asks the questions, you know, that can defeat almost every liberal argument. Number one is compared to what? Number two is at what cost? And number three is where is your hard data? So when we talk about stuff and say, okay, compared to what? We talk about like, oh, things are so hard today. That statement alone is a comparison. When you say things are so hard today, well, that means you're comparing today to a time frame. What time frame are you comparing it to? Or even if you say things are so hard, then I would just ask for clarification, compared to what? Are you seriously going to fix your lips to say that as a Black man today in 2021, are you seriously going to say that your life is harder as a Black man in the United States of America in 2021 than it was for my grandfather as a Black man in Mississippi in 1921? I won't, if he was alive today and I said that to him, he should slap the taste out of my mouth for acting like a punk and saying, yeah, you know, grandpa, man, you know, things are hard today. No, that's stupid. It's just,
okay.
Stop.
So here's my disposition, Christopher, and you gave us your background, right?
Mm-hmm.
You come from a very structured background, right?
Yes.
As do a lot of Black conservatives. They come from a very structured background. Many of them that make these arguments, a lot of the mainstream conservatives, they come with a level of structured background, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you make a lot of valid points, right? And I think when I talked to you and I talked to Merle about this conversation, you both said like the same word. You said tough love, right? And that's pretty much been the conservative approach to the discussion about the Black community and even the motivation for, you know, why they should, you know, maybe consider a different viewpoint, right? But the bottom line is tough love hasn't really been super effective because there's more Black liberals than there are Black conservatives. And we got to figure out why this message is not resonating. Because when you, like you said, and like your brother said, the conservative message, it's very logical. You know what I mean? If you're an individual that don't like big government, if you don't like being taxed, you know, if you don't want the government all in your business and regulating you or whatnot, what reasonable person who wants to be successful wouldn't say, yeah, those are not things that I want, right? You know what I mean? Most people want that. And that seems to be the conservative ideology. But when you get over to the liberal Blacks, it's like a totally different mindset of you owe me something. And I can't be great almost until I get this thing that you owe me, you know, and Black conservatives are selling out and that's why they're successful. So it's like these arguments to me are kind of like, they come from different psychologies, definitely, where you have one group that is attached to victimhood and more altruistic, and then you have this other group that's more individualistic. You know, I moved to the conservative perspective because I believe in individualism. I believe in the opportunity to grow and aspire to become limitlessly. Okay. But that doesn't make, and that's why I attach myself. But I also grew up and see like I told you guys, my situation is unique. because I went from living the reality that the 20% of Blacks lived in for the first 7 years of my life. And so I saw the devastation and what poverty line looks like, feel like for the first 7 years of my life. And then I got into foster care. And then I went into this whole structured family situation. And so I remember, though, and I still have family members that I'm close to that are in those poverty line situations. And one thing that I find that when Black liberals hear the conversation from Black conservatives, they feel like we're not empathetic, because a lot of Black conservatives, when you look at Black conservatives too, and just look at that demographic by itself, right, which is probably what, about 8% of the Black population, possibly. Of those, a lot of those Blacks, like from who migrated from here, they've come from structured backgrounds already, right? Can we agree on that? That African, Caribbean conservatives
Yes.
that come to this country, they're not stigmatized, they're not even indoctrinated with the things that Native Blacks born in America have been indoctrinated with, right?
True.
Right. So when you talk about the arguments and who's presenting the arguments about Black America and what they should do to improve themselves, is it reasonable to believe that the reason that, you know, some of these conservative commentators aren't resonating is because they do seem to have a disconnection to the problems of the community from a psychological and realistic point of view? Let me get Merle to answer that.
I believe it's all about who the media puts out there. With Republicans and conservatives, it's almost like we're going to put out anything of division out there so we can keep the narrative. And like this conversation we're having right now, they would never put it out there because they don't want alternatives resource. They want to keep the message the same way. And like I said, we are the tough love. We are the ones who are from the 80s, who was brought up, if you disrespect your mother, you call out a name, you get smacked, you getting a beating. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. We was based off of responsibility and accountability, and now they're trying to castrate the Black male and feminize us in any kind of way they want to. And what we're doing is we are the last that's left that's basically saying, we are still fighting for the common sense here. We don't want a grown man who thinks he's a woman today going to your little girl's bathroom. Certain basics that, you know, people expect.
I don't want to get into the gender thing because I feel like with the liberal mindset and what they're doing to subvert the Black man into losing his masculinity, that is a conversation completely by itself, in my opinion. But I think when you look at the liberal and the conservative political arguments, this is why I feel like this conversation is important. You know, when you think about the policies that impact us all at the end of the day, at the end of how we all feel about these arguments politically, when an administration is elected into Washington, right, we are all, whether you're Black or white, liberal, conservative, now we have to deal with the residuals of those voting decisions, right? So when we look at the pattern of Black people voting liberal as much as they've done, and then when you look at the sensibilities that come with the conservative point of view, where are we missing the mark?
Well, to answer that question, Angie, here's the thing. Before you can take someone to higher ground, you have to find common ground. And as you and I talked about the other day, we have to acknowledge first and foremost, everybody doesn't want to go to higher ground, right? I mean, it's as crazy as that sounds, like everybody doesn't want to go to heaven, right? I mean, you would think it's like, of course, everybody wants to go to heaven. No, everybody
doesn't. Look at the demonism in the music. We know everybody ain't trying to go to heaven.
Everybody doesn't want to go to heaven, and everybody doesn't. And then, so we start. You know, we're going to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? You're going to start by already saying, first of all, who wants to go to heaven? And unsurprisingly, there's going to be a certain percentage who don't even want to go. Then the next step is like, okay, how many people are willing to do the work? Because we let them know there is work involved in getting to heaven. There is something you have to do to get there. How many people are willing to do that work? Say, how many people are even going to say up front that they're willing to do that work? You have to lay it out to them and you say, okay, Here is the path. There are no guarantees. Too many problems. One of the problems that people have is that they begin with the faulty premise that there is a guaranteed way to get this result. I talk about probabilities and likelihoods. Nothing is guaranteed. Just like people say, well, anytime you say, hey, here's the best case scenario. And the first thing a lot of people do is like, well, I know somebody who tried that and it wasn't successful. Like, so, you start talking about the importance of marriage. Well, I know people who are divorced. Okay, who said that divorce was not going to happen? Who said that you were going to have a perfect life? Nobody's talking about perfection. Let's put that aside. Let's get rid of the idea that there's going to be perfection. Let's talk about probabilities and likelihoods. Do you want this result? Yes or no?
Here's the thing. I feel like Black conservatives, and I think it's worth noting that you have people who have conservative viewpoints, mm-hmm. right? But they have different political leanings, right? So you have your conservative libertarians, you have your conservative Republicans, and my issue, and I've said this to Merle because I know he's running as a write-in for the GOP. It's like my issue with Black conservatives is that they try to convince Black people that leaving one idea, political party, to go over to another is going to solve their problems, right? I have a problem with that notion because the Republicans, in my opinion, hasn't really done a whole lot. I mean, yeah, they slid some things through, gave Black people props with the Civil Rights Act, but for the most part, they have been just as not concerned with the poverty level. Because when we talk about Black Americans, we have to really make sure that people understand that when we're talking about the poverty line Blacks, the high crime Blacks, we're talking about 20% of the population of Black people, right? 20%, about maybe a little bit more, right? So I think first thing we need to do, whether you're right or left, is stop generalizing the entire Black population, okay? The entire Black population can be broken down into economic segments. And I think when we start presenting these arguments, we need to break the Black community down into those economic segments so that we can identify the group that really needs the work, right? Because your LeBrons and your Oprah, those are like the 10% Black people, right?
Angie, I'm sorry to ask you a quick question. When you say the percent that really needs the work or needs the help, who do they need the help from?
They need, to me, in terms of businesses and the government, in my opinion, because we can't talk about and again, I come from the part, like I said, I came from a structured home for the most part, but I did come from the poverty line, right? Mm-hmm. Poverty, people need to understand that poverty is a cycle, and it's also a mentality that is fostered, and it's also cyclical, right? So
poverty is actually the natural state of man, right? I mean, I think people begin with the faulty premise that poverty is caused by something, when in reality, poverty is the norm. Success is caused by something. And so the question is, if poverty is the norm in the world, there's 7.5 billion people in the world, and the overwhelming majority of those 7.5 billion people live in poverty. There's only a certain percentage who live in, let alone a first world kind of existence. And so the question has to be, why does this certain percentage live in this higher quality of life? We don't have to ask the question, why does this percentage live in poverty? Because that's actually the norm. You're born into this norm. You have to decide to create wealth. Wealth is not created in and of itself. You have to purposely create wealth.
Okay, but my thing is, you still got to go back to the fact that some Blacks have better educational opportunities than others. Here's the thing: education is based off of taxes. When you think about it, quality of education is based off of taxes, right?
Well, no, actually, we got to go back to that to disagree with you on that.
Low-income area, you're going to have low-income quality of education down to the teachers. You can go, and nobody can refute me on this, because I go into too many at-risk schools in Detroit, and the equity is not there. My kids do not go to inner city schools, okay? But If there's one institution in this country that you should never see a disparity, it should be education. And it is. And it's because of taxes. If you come from a decent tax bracket, middle class tax bracket, Black family, you're going to have a better shot at education than other Blacks who come from the poverty line. And that's just the truth. And we can't negate that. So when
I had to disagree.
about, oh, education, these people need education. It's like they don't have the taxes to have the same education as you did. And that's the truth.
Well, I'll let Merle.
And I feel like it's not very, when Republicans want to make these arguments about what Black people need, but they don't go into the root cause of those needs and call out what really is going on in terms of the disparity of the education system. And like, to me, you're not doing your job. You're almost covering for the teachers union like the Democrats. Because we know that poverty line Blacks do not get the same education. And if education is the foundation to build individual philosophy of success, then this country is failing a segment of this country, whether they're Black or white. Merle, what do you think?
You're right, but as also us being Black conservatives and more, we also have to point it out just as much as anybody else, whether I know to some they'll say the Republicans, conservative, we still have a duty for ourselves to point this out and add to the fix to it. And
Black conservatives don't, though. And some, and I won't say all of them, but some Black conservatives, to me, are disconnected with the reality of that particular segment of the Black community. And one of my issues with it is with that, their arguments is that they present the reality of the Black community as if these people are just lazy people, deplorables that we really shouldn't feel bad about, right? But we don't really realize that the liberal Blacks that are also bourgeoisies, they have the education, some of them have the structure in their family or whatever, they're empathizing with that group, but they're still not helping them either because they're capitalizing on their condition, right? So there are the 20% in this country that somebody's capitalizing on, from a Black perspective, whether you're a Black liberal making money off of making these people believe that they're still marginalized, or if you're a Black conservative calling them ignorant, right? And so with Black conservatives, the messaging, the ideology is absolutely what will benefit the Black community, but we're not resonating. Right? And the reason we're not resonating is because you have people like Candace Owens. If you listen to her commentary about Black people, and then all you have to do is go into the comments. She literally green lights whites an opportunity to talk about how ignorant Black people are, because we're not framing these discussions in a way that can resonate to the other side. And we got to figure out how to do that. Merrill, I'm sorry.
Yes, we do. And we just have bad messages all the way across the board that spend more time attacking instead of actually solving the problem. And to say that one side is vulnerable or the next, it's not going to do us no good. We have to really directly confront this problem with reasonable solutions. And we are falling behind on that part. And we need stronger leaders. And also we need our own media platforms to be out there more, because they're censoring us. Our voices is there. We have different messages. We just ain't having the platform out there to really talk about it. And they don't want us to be out there.
They want Candace Owens out there talking about it, because Candace Owens is disconnected from that segment of Black America, and she thinks they're deplorable, right? I mean, and when you want to talk about the conservative perspective, Candace Owens and the Daily Wire, they did this roundtable recently after the George Floyd verdict, right? And it seemed like the way that some Black conservatives framed their argument about George Floyd, that they were irritated at the fact that we were spending so much time talking about this criminal. And they spent a lot of time talking about George Floyd's background and who he was, to kind of set the narrative up of why people should not be empathetic towards him. And when you hear rhetoric like that, Black liberals would not listen to something like that and think that Black conservatives have a level of empathy towards the things that have continuously happened in their community. Like, is that fair to say?
It's kind of fair to say, but it's kind of both sides of the argument. You know, I'm going to be honest with you. They have a point in certain aspects, but it's just how they go about it. Let's be honest about it. We need to work on how police and citizens interact with each other so we don't have these problems going on.
Right.
It's just a bad way of saying that. I just simply said that part, and you can understand it and receive it like, hey, police can understand it, and ordinary citizens. Both sides don't want to die. And that's the whole point. And they don't want to have a George Floyd. They don't want to have a Dante Wright. But we constantly have both sides putting ourselves into that. And for Black conservatives, we are going to point out that these incidents could have been done differently had it not been resistant arrest, because we don't want people to die. But
Right.
the Black liberal argument is keep fighting the police, keep doing this, but you're not putting limits there. And people are dying, but you're not paying for the funerals, but you're buying 4 houses and becoming millionaires and basically increasing your self-worth on the exploitation of Black deaths. And we got to stop that. And that's what Black conservatives are saying. Stop exploiting our deaths for profit and start fixing the problem that's causing the deaths.
And see, I would accept that message exactly the way you said it, versus going into the Black victims and, you know, basically characterizing the Black victims. Because at this point, if a man is dead and the Democrats decide to exploit this man's death, right, is the dead man, Black man's fault that the Democrats have capitalized on his death, or is it the Democrats' shame for continuously exploiting and capitalizing on these instances? Either, Christopher, what do you think?
Just the way I'm different. I acknowledge I'm different, and maybe I'm on the extreme end. And I explain that once again because
You're on the Candace Owens side. I get you.
Well, no, the funny thing is, like, I'm indifferent to Candace. I mean, people ask me all the time, like, what do you think about Candace? I don't really think about Candace, and that's not a negative statement about her. It's not. I really don't pay attention to Candace.
But you're the tough lover to the Black community, which a lot of people look at Candace Owens as you have to do.
I don't even like calling myself a tough love to the Black community. I'm a grown man. Okay. Mm-hmm. See, this is the thing. Like, we've gotten to a point where we have redefined things. We've allowed liberals to shape the narrative. I talk like a grown man. Mm-hmm. This is how grown men talk, especially when we talk to other men. Mm-hmm. Period. If you've never been talked to like this, you've never been around grown men. This is how we talk. And so, allow me a second, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
So this is the thing: the structure of the family. We've been led to believe, and like I was saying earlier, I told my parents, I have an issue with the fact that you guys have allowed the narrative to go forward that the current state of the Black community is the result of slavery, when you know good and doggone well it's not. Because my whole life you've always said, oh yeah, my grandparents and great grandparents and all these people were married, and so the current dysfunction that we see is not at all the result of slavery. I mean, and it's kind of stupid when you stop and think about it, because and I want to circle back, like the press secretary, I want to circle back to something you said about education. People don't understand the real history of Blacks in this country. Here's the way
it's constantly being rewritten. You got the 1619 Project about to rewrite it again.
But see, this is what a lot of Black folks have been led to believe. This literally, and I'm going to put it in very blunt terms. A lot of Black folks have been led to believe that we were savages in Africa. Then they believed that we were slaves in America, and then we've been on welfare. And that's all they think we've ever been. And they don't realize about men. And anybody who knows me and they see me, I'm always going to reference Booker T. Washington. They do not. They have no knowledge. of the up from slavery mentality. They don't know. Let me give you some numbers. In 1865, at the end of the the Civil War, there were roughly 4 million. I'm sorry, 1860. There were roughly 4 million blacks in America. That's what the census said, right? And most people don't even know that 10% of us were free blacks. Now, does that, by me mentioning that, am I excusing slavery? No, I'm not excusing slavery, but it does paint a picture to say, oh my God, wait a minute, there were over 400,000 free blacks in the United States of America going into the Civil War. Now we fast forward 50 years. 50 years later, they went from 4 million blacks to 10 million blacks. Here's something people don't understand. They talk about, what about the 40 acres and a mule? Did you know that in 1910, Black folks owned 20 million acres of land? Most people have no clue about that. Now here's the funny thing.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I've had enough conversations with people because you've been taught to disconnect. I mean, general, you when I say this, you've been taught to disconnect these things because if you have conversations with people, they're like, oh yeah, well, yeah, my grandparents, they still own, 50 acres of land that my great grandfather bought back in 1905. I hear people, yeah, my family owns land in Mississippi or in Maryland or so on and so forth. I'm like, so wait a minute, how do you think they bought that land 100 years ago? There has been there was Black wealth because there was structure in the Black community that immediately Booker T. Washington talked about that. As soon as slavery was over, his stepfather, right, because it's not his biological father, because his biological father was a white guy, his stepfather, who had married his mother, as soon as slavery was over, he walked from West Virginia back to Virginia to grab and bring Booker and his mother and his brother with him to West Virginia. That happened all the time. Immediately following slavery, we went out of our way to reconstitute our families. If you go and do a search and look at Black families, look at pictures of Black people prior to the Great Migration in the 1920s, when my family moved from Mississippi up to Detroit, or your family might have moved from Arkansas up to Chicago and all that. Black folks, you look at the pictures, it is always a patriarchal picture. There's always a father and sons and wives and then all that. It's always like that. So when we talk about poverty, yes, we might not have been rich, but Black folks had family structure and they were building something. And on top of that, they went out of the way to make sure their children had education. Ask yourself this, why is it that people like Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave, why was he more literate and articulate than Jesse Jackson? Why is it that Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave and it was prohibited for him to learn, he got beat for trying to learn how to read. He ran away at the age of roughly 21 years old, but he had been beaten as he was trying to learn how to read. How is it that someone born and raised in slavery became more literate and articulate than the majority of Black folks today? There was no Department of Education. The Department of Education itself wasn't even broken out into as a cabinet level position until 1979, 1980 in Jimmy Carter. Prior to that, it was part of like the Health and Welfare and Education Department, or whatever like that. And then let's look at the movie Hidden Figures. So ask yourself this: how did the women who were part of the Hidden Figures movie, how did they get to be so good at math when they did not have the benefit of a U.S. Department of Education? How is it that men like A.G. Gaston, how did he become as literate as he was? And A.G. Gaston built a net worth in excess of $100 million if there was no U.S. Department of Education. I just say that, Angie, and I'll stop here. I just say that to say I have to disagree strongly with the idea that having equity in taxes and a U.S. Department of Education is the answer when we were more educated before there was a U.S.
No,
Department
I didn't say that was the answer. What I said was that it's the root cause of the disparity. Like, again, regardless, I feel like from decade to decade, like everybody has noticed that things has changed. Society continues to change. And there's a lot of factors in between different changes where I feel like we need to be a little bit more understanding to what policies over time has done to people and done to communities. Like, yes, I feel like poverty has always existed around the world. You always have a poverty class, right? But when we talk about the arguments of the Black community, right, and we talk about what needs to happen or how we can help those communities, right? And then Black conservatives are like, well, you need to keep the families together and you need to give better education. And I'm saying, okay, well, education right now, the quality of your education right now is dependent upon your tax bracket. So, and we acknowledge the fact that family structures are not together right now, right? Black families are disseminated, right? They
Well, but Angie, neither of my parents were 17 and 18 years old when they got married. Both of them, my father actually dropped out of high school. Now,
but your parents were not influenced by the things like, and I think that, you know, when you think about these arguments and what one group of people from one decade did to another, you have to understand that you guys did not have, your parents didn't have access to the information levels and flows the way that you did. And then even my generation, we are information overloaded, right? It's just a lot of information and access to a lot of information that has influenced society in a very negative way, whether you're a Black family or a white family. There's a lot of societal influences that have infiltrated the American people's minds that has disseminated the family, whether it's Black or white. You know, the TV shows have changed. My mom told me back in the day, I Love Lucy, her and her dude weren't even in the same bed together. You know, we as a society has become very desensitized. So what one generation of people and even their mindset was back in the day, it's just not going to be the same today, in my opinion. And so,
but why not? But why can't we? I mean, like, that's the whole.
Because it's not. I mean, it's very obvious. Like, you know, like, I mean, I know that, you know, ideally we could go back to the fabrics of those principles that kept America moral and logical, right? And we should, right? But that's like, you know, that's beyond, you know, social economic ideology, right? That's
but it is happening. That's the only thing I have to say about that. It's actually happening day in. There are, now they don't get the spotlight, but there are families who are making the conscious decision. You know, there are people who are consciously deciding, hey, a woman who decide, I'm not going to have a child until I'm married. Right. Or let's go to Professor Walter Williams, who passed unfortunately back in December. Walter Williams is his famous things, the 5 things that you do to avoid poverty. Right. I don't know if you've seen this before. He says, number 1, graduate from high school. Right. And preferably go on to some sort of college or technical school. That's number. And I'll have to ask, first things first, what evil white man can prevent you from graduating from high school? Right. So let's address that. Is there any evil white man that can prevent you from graduating from high school? The answer
no, it's not an evil white man. It's that evil thing called poverty, right?
Yeah, but poverty doesn't stop people from graduating from high school, because
it does if you're going to school hungry every day and you don't know if you even gonna eat from one day to another. I'm sorry, I can't even function if I'm hungry. So I can't imagine what these kids in the inner city who not and they're victims of the decisions of their parents, right? When we think about kids in poverty, we got to think about people who are victims of the decisions of their parents, who happen to be victims of their decisions of their parents. You know, we're talking about people who live in a cycle of bad decision making. And
let me give you an example.
There are people who are able to get out there, but they were able to get connected with an influence that was able to get them out there. I feel like, you know, when you talk about poverty and what some people at the poverty line should do, I think that it's, you know, you have to look at the psychology of what poverty does to people. And if you've never been in poverty, if you never lived in poverty, you know, poverty is the reason that crime rates are up. Poverty is the reason why unemployment rates are up. And you got to look at those psychological factors to understand that segment of the community. And if you're going to speak on that segment of the community, you can be, you know, rational, you know, but I think that there also should be a level of empathy, you know, to be able, because here's the thing, like I said, Black conservatives are only 10% of the Black community, if that, right? And we don't resonate to most of our community, right? And that's because we make assumptions about what, and not all of us, but some of us make assumptions about what we experienced and what our upbringing was and what our influences were. Like, come on, Christopher. I think that most young Black men would swim through a sea of thumbtacks to have the upbringing that you had.
So, well, here's a question. Then, what was President Barack Obama's message? Anyone? What was his message?
I don't know. I didn't even pay attention to him.
It was hope, right? Merle, is that what President Obama? Was hope, right?
Hope and change.
So here's the thing, but we have to acknowledge, especially as Christians, right? It's hope and faith, but you have to have hope. So how do you get hope? You get hope by someone telling you. It's the power of the spoken word. Someone telling you there's hope. Mm-hmm. See, this is the thing people talk. Well, people in this cycle of poverty, they're trapped in this hopelessness. Okay, so we have to give them hope. How do we give them hope? We give them hope by letting them know there is better out there. Other people have achieved it coming from because people say, well, you need to be able to go back in the hood and be able to relate to people. Okay, let me show you someone who's from the hood. And I'm sure, like Merle, right? Part of your message, the reason you have conservative Blacks like Merle who are running for office, they always say, hey, like my buddy Kelvin King, who is running for U.S. Senate in Georgia. Kelvin, he came from a single parent background. Right, his mom had him at like 15 years old. Kelvin should be in jail on drugs anywhere besides a successful entrepreneur who's a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and all that. He should not be where he is, but he had hope. So we're here to offer you hope. I want to tell you.
Well, we need more people like him going, and like, to me,
but the thing is, you need to tell people stories, and if you're going to give people hope, you have to be able to tell them, here's the story of here's someone who came from the same environment that you came from. They're not looking down upon you.
But hearing you say it is different than hearing the person that actually experienced it and went through. Because my thing is, yeah, we can talk about, the cycles of poverty from like any race, and we can acknowledge the fact that there are some people that get out of those situations by just being natural. Some people are born with just a sensibility where they know, like I'll tell you, when I was 6 years old in poverty, right? I was 6 years old knowing that how I was living was not right. I knew that at 6 years old that the crime and the things that I was afraid of and the things I experienced, I knew even that early on that it wasn't right. And I did not, and I made a decision that I didn't want to live like that anymore, regardless. And I even wanted to run away at 6 years old because it was just a terrible environment to be in, right? And I think that, like, if I had grown up in that environment, I would not have the same mental disposition that I have today. I was actually rescued by the state of Michigan. And that's how I was able to get the structure that helped structure my mind. Right. But, I feel like as a conservative, because I come from those experiences, I can speak to my community with a level of empathy of knowing what they've gone through, but also letting them know that there is a pathway out. Right. And those are very valuable conversations to have to a community that, to me, people are seemingly not really in tune with psychologically.
No, I don't want to dominate the conversation. I know I've taken way too much time from Merle.
Merle, you gotta chime in. This is a free for all.
I know, but y'all was doing too good at that point. I was like, okay, let's hear this one out. Overall, I think one of the things we have to do is be respectful of the past, and I think people have been very disrespectful of the past and what people have been through. But we also have to recognize it's time to move forward. Our ancestors didn't go through what they went through for us to continue to say, live in the past so you don't have a future. They want us to have a future and be successful and go after our goals. That's what they died for. And once we start doing that and stop making the excuses, but also at the same time frame say, hey, I acknowledge this was bad back in the day. And everybody is saying that, but they get tired of being hit with a hammer if you already saying, hey, I know what happened in the past is wrong. Okay, but most of us didn't have nothing to do with the past. We're not going to start racism with everybody. I'm sorry. Some people are just going to be racist in nature. That's why I call we can't everybody.
Racism is a living ideology. It is here to stay, just like all the pollinated plants on the on the earth. I am over this race card, because it's like, just like the Constitution is a living document that should preserve forever. Racism is one of those terrible ideologies that happens to be in the social contract that's never going to go away. It's a generational.
It's actually not a living document. It's an amendable document. It says what it says, but it can be amended. It's not.
But it's living. In my opinion, they shouldn't kill it. And they're
doing
it
when
right
I say
now.
living, it because it's based off of principles, right? And so it says that they did put mechanisms in place so that if society changes over time, they can make amendments.
They can give it a facelift.
But they wanted to make it so that it wasn't something that could just happen willy-nilly, so that you could come around. I mean, the founders and framers were amazingly prescient. They understood human nature and human behavior way more than most people do today. I do want to say one thing, though, like, it's the whole topic of Black authenticity. And that's something that, quite frankly, it pisses me off. The whole conversation where we act as if you're only authentically Black if you've had this Black, like when people act like there's a Black experience. What is a Black experience? In order to say that there's such a thing as Black authenticity, you're actually giving credence to the whole idea that any sort of racist, white supremacist person might have. They're saying, okay, you in your own community are saying that there's only one way to be Black. And so if you're saying there's only one way to be Black, how could they be racist for saying, yeah, all Blacks are the same? See, we want to sit there and act as
I don't believe in Black authenticity, but I do believe that there's an experience of Black Americans that resonates with a lot of majority of Blacks, because they've experienced it, you know what I mean? And the residuals of those experiences definitely play into how Blacks are impacted in the social and political process.
The Cosby Show. Let's look back at the Cosby Show. I distinctly remember reading articles in Jet Magazine and Ebony Magazine where Black folks were openly saying that show ain't real, because they had been led to believe that Good Times was the only representation of Black folks. And so that you had to be poverty, that you had to be all that. And it's like, and even in my profession, I work here in the Washington, D.C. area. I spent over a decade working in the federal government. And it still boggles my mind the number of Black folks who were here in the D.C. area, and they love to tout their Black authenticity, because they're like, yeah, I'm from the hood and everything like that, right? And they will come to me and act like they're more authentically Black than me because they're from the hood. And I'm like, but where do you live now? And they live in Prince George.
I look at that as a level of Black authenticity. I think that, and some people, they may use that as like a stripe of saying that, hey, I went from this extreme to the other extreme. I look at people saying I'm from the hood, meaning that I'm somebody that made it from the poverty reality. And those are the people that you want to hear. Like, to me, those are the people, if they're conservative, they should be talking to Black people and nobody else.
But Angie, here's the thing. This is what I was saying. The problem,
they know how to talk to that group,
but they don't. Here's the problem I have with them: is they're raising their kids like the Washington, D.C. area. Prince George's County is the wealthiest, predominantly Black county in the country. It is full of Black folks living in 4,000 square foot homes, matching his and hers BMWs, Mercedes, because both of them are GS 13s, 14s, and 15s. Both the husband and wife, if they're married, making six figures. The kids got 60-inch big screen TVs and Air Jordans and everything like that. They live a very privileged lifestyle. Mm-hmm. But let them tell it that if you think like I think, you're some Uncle Tom Sellard who's out of touch. But I want to say is like, do you realize your children are growing up more privileged than I grew up? How in touch with what you call Black authenticity are your children when they're being born and raised in 4,000 and 5,000 square foot homes, mom and dad making multiple six figures? My dad was enlisted in the military. We ain't have no money, right? I never went without, but I never had nice things. I just grew up in a structure. And I was saying earlier, once again, my dad dropped out of high school. My mom was a high school graduate, but yet somehow, because of the structure, they still held on to the principles. One thing that happened, my sister and I both were reading before we entered elementary school because my mother made it a point to make sure that we were literate. And so where
And
did
how did
government
she
play
do
a
that?
role?
Let me ask you something. How did your mother do that?
Because she was married to my father and she
Okay,
made
and so she was probably not working, right?
no, my mom did. My mom ended up going to, she worked part-time jobs.
Part-time.
She was able to do that because they were married. This is where Walter Williams said, number one, graduate from high school. Number two, don't have any kids until you're at least 21 years old.
But do you understand that these arguments, to me, when it talks about like, and here's the thing, a two income household family is definitely the best way to beat inflation, right? I mean, because that's really what two people working in a household to me was all about. I don't believe the women entered into the workplace because they just really wanted to get a job. I mean, it was a way to keep the home economically sound, in my opinion, because we still all deal with inflation, whether you're poverty line, middle class.
Actually, inflation exploded after women started working outside the home. That's one of the things that ended up happening. If you notice, in the 1960s, when more women chose to work outside the home, then the government policies changed and the inflation rate exploded. We didn't have high
women. So, are you saying that women is the reason is the cause of inflation?
No, what I'm saying is that literally you had some government policies. When you go and look at the Great Society happened in 1965, right? Then there was a result of more women started walking away from their marriages, right? And so you had fewer women staying married.
But you
right?
said that, but you mentioned the Great Society from an economical standpoint, devastating communities. So the Great Society did have an economical impact on even all American families, where a supplemental income needed to happen in order for them to stay afloat.
But if you go and track, right, you can look at the Fed Reserve data. I've looked at all this stuff. You can go and look at the Fed Reserve data. You can see that inflation did not happen at this massive number until the 1970s, right? That's why you had guys like Jimmy Carter talking about whip, right? Whip inflation now. The inflation, you had the oil shortage, which there really was no shortage of oil. We've always had oil. They just weren't sure. They didn't know where it was. Inflation exploded under the Carter administration, 1976. We did not have massive inflation until after the Carter administration. There are all these things that the groundwork was laid. And this is why I like to focus on informing and educating people about how we got to be where we are. I like to give people hope and letting them know.
That's important too.
But it's important to know, and I'm always focusing on trying to put history in context, in the proper context, because people, you've heard a narrative, right? You've heard a story, but you've heard a story, but you have not heard the story. The story is all the facts in proper context without trying to push a narrative.
Right. And so I'll tell you this, like my viewpoint is that I don't think that, like, when I listen to the arguments of Black conservatives, right, there's very little that you can refute in anything that any of them say. You know what I mean? No matter, what they're saying, a lot of the points that a lot of Black conservatives make about what is the cause of the Black dysphoria, and also what needs to happen to keep the community, to make the community feel more equitable. I feel like, these arguments, in my opinion, I feel like the points are very valid, but the delivery method is the reason that I feel that there is a level of muteness to the message from Black conservatives. Merle, I want to get your perspective on that comment. What do you feel about the messaging? Like, can we all agree that what Black conservatives say is the truth, but the delivery is what's keeping this message from not resonating with the liberal Blacks?
Absolutely. And I would say most people don't realize, once you're a parent, most of the time frame, you're raising your kids as being a conservative, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. You start looking at things like, I want my kids to survive. When I grew up, I couldn't go outside after school unless I finished my homework. It was mandatory. My parents kept that pattern up, and my mother was a single mother, raising us. And I always did my homework because she stayed on top of it. My older sister was also structured that way, so she stayed on top of me as well as doing her homework. When we had that type of structure, we don't have all that separation that we have out there. And the sad thing about it is these same parents say they are Democrats, but don't realize you are very, very conservative.
And we all want those things for our kids.
Yes, and the thing is, they're scared to acknowledge it because they feel like the same thing. We're going to be excommunicated out of our social circle, just like Republicans may be if they decide to agree with something on the liberal side. The fact is, we got to get back to common sense. Once we get to common sense, you're going to start seeing that barrier separation coming together stronger than ever. So that would be my point onto that one. We got to work on communication and our messaging. How I just said that, anybody can sit down at the table and say, hey, I can agree with that, but you got bad messages who want to inflame people, and that's the problem. We are not going to get anywhere.
Well, yeah, and I think that's because we're over an hour now, and I want to be respectful of you gentlemen's time, and I really do appreciate this discussion because I think that having these different perspectives, like Christopher, you are a structured conservative, and you definitely you have the structure, you have that structural background, and I think that and I don't want anyone or even you to feel like I don't feel like you're authentically Black because you don't come from a reality that I come from or I've experienced, you know what I mean? But I think that it is valid, that we all as Black people can talk about the problems of our community, but each one of us are going to talk about those problems from a different perspective and experience. And when we're talking about Black conservatism, how are our perspectives and our experiences resonating to Black liberals? And we can see that there's some sensibilities that Black liberals can pull out of the conservative perspective, but there's some reluctancy because there's beliefs that all conservatives are Republican, right? I'm not a Republican. I don't consider myself a Republican. I'd probably be closer to libertarian, but we want to get rid of some of these misconceptions. So like there's
no room for conservatives in the Democratic Party. They've made it absolutely clear that they are the antithesis of all conservative beliefs. I mean, from everything from their non-traditional family structures of
they hate God,
girl. And so unfortunately, however you want to look at it, if you hold any sort of conservative viewpoints, there is no place for you in the current Democratic Party. They have made it absolutely clear. If you're a Christian, there's no place for you in the Democratic Party. If you believe that a boy has a penis and a girl has a vagina, guess what? There's no place for you in the Democratic Party. If you
believe that a woman in a marriage is equal to her husband and he is not the head of the household, you don't, yes.
So
it's interesting because when we look at the degradation of society, the Democrats have been all over the demoralization of American culture and values. Like we have to fight for conservatism. I do have to run, but I appreciate the time. Yes, absolutely. We got to get going. Yes, thank you guys so much. We're going to follow up on Hyphenated America because I do want to dig more into the tribalization aspects of this conversation as well, Christopher, because you're very strong in your opinions and I love them. So thank you so much. Merle, thank you so much for joining the discussion too. You're running for governor of Virginia. That should be cool. Before I end this podcast though, and you guys, if you want to sign off, that's fine. I wanted to give a plug to my friend Alaric, can I get that on there? This is the Babylon Cipher. I'm gonna have him on. Can you see that? This is a Babylon Cipher. I just got it a couple of days ago, so I'm not going to give you a clear overview. But Alaric, if you're watching, I did plug you, and I look forward to having you on to talk about this book. Everyone, thank you so much for joining in. We will have our next discussion is going to be talking about self-actualization, and I think a lot of the points that we've talked about here really connects to self-actualization, and that's May 8th. So tune into the next podcast, and thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. God bless everyone.